In the fall of 1829, a prospector named Elias Tatum was working a shallow cut above Duke's Creek in the hills north of a settlement then called Knucklesville, in the newly formed Lumpkin County, Georgia. The rush that would draw thousands of men into these mountains within 2 years had barely begun. Tatum was one of the first. He was cutting into a hillside with a mattock and a pan, following a seam of quartz that showed color at the surface, working the way most of the early diggers worked, by hand, by eye, and by the instinct of men who had done this kind of labor before, in Carolina creek beds and Virginia placer cuts, long before Georgia had gold of its own. He expected clay, then rotten quartz, and if he was fortunate, enough color to carry to the trading post. About 6 feet into the hillside, his mattock broke through into open space. Not a crack, not a seam. A hollow, wide enough that when he pushed his arm through the gap, he felt nothing beneath his hand but air. He widened the opening and looked in by torchlight. What the fire showed him was not a natural cavity in the rock. It was a room. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Tatum did not go back in alone. He walked half a mile to the claim of a man named Josiah Blaylock, working a neighboring cut on the same ridge, and brought him back before touching anything further. Blaylock crawled in behind him with a second torch, and it was Blaylock who first noticed that the walls did not sound right when struck with the flat of a hand pick, a dull, packed thud, rather than the ring of solid country rock. The two men spent the better part of an afternoon inside before either one said the word room out loud, as though naming it made the thing more real than finding it had. Neither man left a written account. What survives comes down through Blaylock's grandson, who repeated the story to a Lumpkin County historian collecting local recollections in the 1890s, more than 60 years after the fact. A second-hand chain that any honest telling of this story has to admit, rather than smooth over. The chamber Tatum had opened was cut into decomposed schist and vein quartz, not blasted, not worked with iron. It measured roughly 10 feet across and stood barely 5 feet at its highest point, low enough that a grown man had to bend at the waist to move through it. The walls did not show the clean facets a chisel leaves, and they did not show the scalloped fracture pattern of black powder. They showed something else. Blunt, rounded depressions, overlapping in long, shallow lines, the kind of mark left by a hand striking stone against stone thousands of times over months or years rather than minutes. Scattered across the floor were dozens of fist-sized cobbles, some cracked in half, some worn smooth on one end and battered on the other, the unmistakable shape of hammerstones. The ceiling above the widest part of the chamber was black with soot, and beneath the soot, the rock had a reddish, brittle quality that iron and black powder do not produce. Heat had been applied there, directly, and more than once. Ash lay in a shallow depression near the back wall, protected from 2 centuries of groundwater by an overhang of stone. Tatum did not know what fire setting was. He did not know that heating a quartz face and then dousing it with cold water was a mining method older than the wheel in most parts of the world, used to shatter hard rock without a single iron tool. He knew only that someone had built a fire in this room, more than once, deliberately, in a spot chosen so the heat and the smoke could work exactly where the rock was hardest. The geology of the Georgia Gold Belt does not produce hollows on its own. This is not limestone country. There is no karst here, no soluble bedrock, none of the slow underground dissolution that carves natural chambers into the hills of Missouri or the Ozark Plateau. The rock above Duke's Creek is Piedmont schist laced with quartz veins, metamorphic stone that fractures along predictable planes and does not dissolve, does not hollow, and does not produce open rooms through any weathering process known to the geology of the region. A crevice, yes. A void along a fault line, occasionally. A 10-foot chamber with a level floor, a flattened ceiling, and walls scarred by hammerstone and fire in a consistent, repeated pattern. Never. Whatever stood in front of Tatum's torch that afternoon had been made, not found, and the country rock around it offered no other explanation for how it came to exist. He followed the back wall of the chamber a few feet further and found where the room ended. It ended at a seam of quartz, thick with visible gold, running deeper into the hill than his torchlight could reach. Whoever had cut this room by hand and fire had stopped an arm's length short of it. Tatum had not found gold first. He had found the room first, and the gold was waiting exactly where the room stopped. Lumpkin County in 1829 sat inside the boundary of the Cherokee Nation, though Georgia had already begun extending its own state law over the territory in defiance of federal treaty. The gold rush that followed Tatum's find, and the finds of dozens of men like him in the same 2 years, became, by most accounts, the first sustained gold rush in United States history, predating California by nearly 2 decades. It brought roughly 10,000 miners into the North Georgia mountains within 18 months, and it hardened the political pressure that produced the Georgia Land Lottery of 1832, which carved Cherokee land into 40-acre gold lots and distributed them by lucky draw to white citizens who had never set foot on the ground. 6 years later, the same pressure emptied the Cherokee Nation from these mountains entirely, along the route that came to be called the Trail of Tears. The gold itself was minted into coin at a federal branch mint built at Dahlonega in 1838, a few miles from where Tatum had swung his mattock. None of the surviving mint ledgers record where any particular ounce of gold came from. None of the land lottery records mention what lay beneath the soil of the lots they distributed, 40 acres at a time, drawn by names pulled from a wheel in the state capitol by men who had never walked the ground they were signing away. What survives instead is scattered, second-hand, and stubborn. George White, compiling his 1854 survey of Georgia's counties, recorded testimony gathered from miners across the Gold Belt describing what they called ancient diggings, worked stone tools, and small hollowed chambers found ahead of the vein, features the miners themselves, generally credited to Spanish prospectors, said to have worked the region 3 centuries earlier, following the failed expedition of Hernando de Soto through these same mountains in 1540. White recorded the accounts without confirming them, and without dismissing them, which is itself a kind of record. He was cataloguing folklore that miners were telling each other in the 1830s and 1840s, at a time when nobody in Lumpkin County had any professional reason to invent a story about somebody else getting to the gold first. The De Soto story had one thing going for it. It was already circulating in the region before the rush began, attached to older reports of Spanish beads and metal fragments turned up along river bottoms further south, and it gave 19th century Georgians a tidy, European origin for anything strange found in the ground. It required no admission that the mountains had been worked, deliberately and skillfully, by the people Georgia had just finished removing at gunpoint. A room cut by fire and stone, sitting exactly where a rich vein waited, was easier to file under Conquistador legend than to sit with as evidence of a mining tradition that belonged to the Cherokee, the Muskogee, or their predecessors, on land the state had just taken. The Spanish explanation did not hold up well once anyone looked closely at the tools left behind. De Soto's expedition carried iron picks, iron wedges, and steel-edged tools, the same equipment used in Spanish mining operations throughout Mexico and Peru during the same century. Nothing recovered from any of the chambers described in the miners' accounts, including the room Tatum opened, showed a single mark consistent with iron. Every tool found inside was stone. Every mark on every wall was the blunt, repetitive scarring of a hammerstone or the heat-fractured surface left by fire and water, not the clean cut of a European mining pick. Whoever excavated these rooms did it with the same technology available to the region's inhabitants for thousands of years before any Spaniard crossed the Georgia mountains, and did it with a level of patience that a 3-week Spanish reconnaissance expedition, moving fast and starving, was never positioned to spend. The Spanish story was comforting because it kept the mystery contained to a single known expedition with a known ending. The physical evidence points somewhere older, and somewhere that nobody in 1829 had any incentive to name. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Tatum's room was not an isolated find, though for most of the 19th century nobody treated it as anything other than a curiosity to be cleared out and mined through. Miners across the North Georgia Gold Belt reported similar chambers at Duke's Creek at Louds Creek, and along the ridge above Yahula, always ahead of a rich vein, always cut by hand and fire rather than iron, always abandoned by whoever built them before the gold itself was reached. None of these rooms were preserved. Each one, including Tatum's, was widened, blasted, and eventually swallowed by the deeper shaft or the open cut that followed the vein it had been guarding. The evidence exists today only in the second-hand accounts collected by White and by a handful of local historians who followed him, describing rooms that no longer physically exist in any form an archaeologist could examine. What does exist, and what ties Tatum's chamber to something larger than a single Georgia hillside, is the wider pattern of prehistoric hard rock extraction across the southern Appalachians. Roughly 90 miles northeast of Lumpkin County, in the mica-bearing ridges of what is now the Spruce Pine District, straddling the Georgia and North Carolina mountains, archaeologists have documented shallow prehistoric quarry pits cut into mica-bearing pegmatite, worked with the same fire and hammerstone method, dated broadly to the centuries surrounding the turn of the Common Era. These pits are not folklore. They are physically present, catalogued and studied. Small hollowed workings in solid rock with no metal tool marks anywhere inside them. The sheet mica extracted from pits like these did not stay in the mountains. Large cut sheets of Appalachian mica, shaped into silhouettes of hands, claws, and serpents, have been recovered from the Hopewell Mound centers of the Ohio Valley, at sites including the Hopewell Mound Group and Mound City, more than 400 miles from where the raw material was quarried. Geochemical sourcing work, comparing the trace mineral signature of Ohio mound mica to Appalachian deposits, has tied specific mound offerings back to the mountains of Georgia and western North Carolina. A sheet of mica cut by hand in a chamber not unlike Tatum's could travel on foot and by river for weeks before it was laid inside a burial 1,000 miles from the fire that split it loose, carried by people who left no name attached to either end of the journey. A second, closer pattern sits inside Georgia's own Piedmont, south and east of the Gold Belt, where documented steatite quarries, worked for soapstone cooking vessels beginning in the late Archaic period, roughly 3,000 years before present, show the identical hollowed bedrock signature. Shallow, low-ceiling chambers, fire scarring on the working face, hammerstones left behind in the tailings once the workable stone was exhausted, dropped where the last blow landed because there was no reason to carry a spent tool back out. State archaeological surveys have catalogued dozens of these quarry sites across the Georgia and Carolina Piedmont over the past century, and the method recorded at each one, heat the face, cool it fast, strike what breaks loose, is functionally identical to what Tatum described finding above Duke's Creek. The method is consistent across material, across distance, and across centuries. Fire, water, stone, patience, and a room left behind once the workable rock ran out or the vein it was guarding was reached by somebody else, generations later, chasing gold instead of mica or soapstone. The uncomfortable part of this pattern is not the mining technique. Fire setting is documented on every continent where hard rock needed to be broken before metal tools existed to do it faster. The uncomfortable part is timing. The men who found these rooms in the 1830s were standing on land the Cherokee Nation had occupied for generations. Land the state of Georgia would finish clearing of its Cherokee residents within a decade of Tatum's discovery, in a removal that scattered entire towns west along a route thousands did not survive. Whether the room above Duke's Creek belongs to a Cherokee mining tradition specifically, to an earlier woodland or Mississippian period culture that predates any nation living there in 1829, or to some combination the archaeological record has not yet untangled, is a real question with a real gap where the answer should be. Nobody asked it at the time. There was no reason to ask a question whose honest answer might complicate a land lottery already underway, and every reason to reach instead for a story about Spanish conquistadors who had been gone for 300 years and could not object to the telling. None of this proves who cut the room above Duke's Creek, and the honest record does not permit more than that. No inscription survives inside it, no burial, no ornament, nothing that would let an archaeologist assign the chamber to a specific culture or a specific century with confidence. What the physical evidence permits is narrower and, in its own way, more solid. Somebody worked hard rock in these mountains long before any miner arrived chasing a vein in 1829, using fire instead of iron, and stopped short of the gold either because the vein had not yet been reached, or because gold itself was not what the room had been dug for in the first place. Mica does not require a gold rush to be valuable, neither does soapstone. A room cut for one resource can sit for centuries before somebody else, chasing a different resource entirely, breaks through its far wall and calls it a discovery. Lumpkin County today bears almost no visible trace of any of this. The open cuts and shaft mines that consumed the gold belt through the 1840s, and again during a brief revival at the turn of the 20th century, erased the surface the miners once described, turning ridgelines into terraced pits and burying most of the small early workings under decades of tailings. No professional excavation has ever been conducted specifically to locate a surviving prehistoric chamber in the Georgia Gold Belt. No state agency has funded a survey comparing the Dukes Creek accounts to the documented mica and steatite quarries a day's walk to the northeast. The record exists in the second-hand testimony of 19th century miners and in the physical, independently verified quarry pits sitting in the mountains around them, and nobody has yet put the two side by side with a shovel and a research budget. The tools to do this properly already exist. LiDAR survey, now standard in Appalachian archaeology for stripping forest cover away from a digital model of the ground beneath it, has revealed quarry pits and old workings across the region that no ground team had ever mapped by eye. The same method, flown over the ridges above Dukes Creek and Louds Creek, could locate any surviving hollow the 19th century shaft mines happened to miss, a chamber sealed off by a rockfall or a collapsed adit, rather than blasted through entirely. Comparing what turns up against the known steatite and mica quarry pits to the northeast would settle, with physical evidence rather than second-hand testimony, whether the tradition Tatum stumbled into belonged to the same hands that worked those better documented sites. That survey has never been flown. That comparison has never been made. Elias Tatum kept mining Dukes Creek for another 6 years before the surface deposits thinned and he moved on, like most of the men who came after him, following later strikes toward the Etowah and eventually out of Georgia entirely. He is not recorded as having grown wealthy from the vein the room had guarded. Placer gold in these mountains rewarded volume and luck more often than any single rich strike, and by most accounts Tatum left Georgia with little more than he had carried into it. What he found in the fall of 1829 was never recorded by his own hand. He could not write. It survives because a county historian thought a miner's strange story about an ancient room was worth setting down on paper before it vanished, along with the man who told it, one voice removed from the moment the torch first caught the walls. The room itself is gone now, blasted through and mined out before anyone thought to measure it properly, but the pattern it belonged to is not. It sits in ridgelines from western North Carolina to the burial mounds of the Ohio Valley, in every quarry pit cut by fire instead of iron, in every hammerstone left behind once the rock gave up what it had. Tatum went looking for gold and found a room that somebody else had already finished with. The gold had been waiting there the whole time. It simply was not first.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.